Hello, my name is Andrew Brooks. This is another presentation on nonlinear existentialism. The question at hand is a question of men and women. Specifically, as the title suggests, is trying to figure out if there is a difference or a reason for the difference, if there is one, in the cognition between men and women. The questions that I was posing are pretty straightforward, and I'll try to, within the context of the frequency amplitude modulation processing unit that I've talked to or endeavored to illustrate in the previous presentation, see if how that relates to if there is differences in cognition, how it relates to the FAM processor, and put in the context of purely functionality. In this, as with other cases, I've always tried to not engage too many morality and other things, any abstractions that could try to fog the issues at hand. Most of the time, FAM is a physiological paradigm, one that's grown up through evolutionary pressures that shown it through anthropology and the other sciences. So we're going to try to stay within this context. So the question, or questions, do the genders inherently think, process input differently than each other, and if so, how and why? And in this case, processes to change, to alter, to modify. We have two different things we look at, the background of anthropology and evolution. The general fact, the primary difference between the genders in mammals and other species is one gives birth and one does not. The other one, specific values for Homo sapiens, is that their ability to be within many different types of environments and do well in these environments. And amongst the mental and physical attributes which allow for this to occur is the expanded encephalization, larger brain, and better structures within that organ, bipedalism, and standing upright, and the use of complex and multifaceted range of tools. The assertion I want to have here is the use of physiological truths may be the cause of the social, cultural, physiological differences displayed and observed between by the genders. So the differences I want to think about to explore with the FAM processors are it's perhaps a FAM processor itself and how it's engaged in the environment that perhaps is the difference between the male and the female. So what we're looking at is, again, we're going into the idea of keeping this to evolution, keeping this to functionality, and straying away from abstractions and any other ideas and thoughts that can be brought up to say that a male and female are better or weaker or whatever. The idea is that if you put a material, organic material, in an environment and it's able to change itself based on different pressures in that environment, then it's a functional case, and you cannot really add morality to it unless the individual, it becomes an individual that reproductive material grows and differentiates into male and female, and the male and female is aware of themselves, then morality can come into the play. But what I'm doing in this presentation is functionality. So for functionality, being able to reproduce, of course, reproductive, it also will affect the endocrine system, skeletal, and musculature, because when someone's able to give birth or bear a child, it's going to change them in many ways. Skeletal, of course, the pelvic girdle, the ability to pass a child through musculature, attachment points and such. It's going to change how much muscle, where the muscle is, and such. The male frame and the female frame will be different based on the ability to give birth. And the biggest one, and this is what I'm going to be linking into the FAM processor, is, as stated, the ability to give birth reduces the strength and size of the female's physiology in comparison to the male. That's truth. It could be hypothesized that to compensate for this, so as to increase the probability of survival of not only themselves but their offspring, the spring sensory apparatus, that's going to be the nervous system and the external nerves, external organs of reception, and how they relate to the nervous system, how they change. So the thing is that female sensory apparatus and related structures have become more sensory receptive to the environment. So whereas for the male, they're able to dominate in some way through their physical abilities, the female, in order to survive and also the child to survive, have developed in that fashion. This sensitivity increases the amount of information the female nervous system can process at any given time in comparison to the male. So this is perhaps not agreed on as a truth, but one that would assert that given evolutionary pressures and other observations is a possibility. So given that idea, we're going to ask, how does this relate to the nonlinear existentialism? As before, central to that is going to be the FAM processor, where there's going to be frequency modulation to allow for linear understanding of time or perception of time, and then it's going to be the amplitude modulation, which is allowed through, I wouldn't say mistake, but a natural evolution of the ability to bind with no teleological purpose per se, but it did occur within this context. So the amplitude modulation, we're going to see how this may relate to the idea that the female has more sensory input than the male does. So the key to the NAL is energetics, increased cerebral energy through incremental variance, positive and negative feedback. You can go back to the previous presentations to get more information on this one. But continue processing the information until the energetics is reached, that if there's a certain amount of energy that needs to be done, it reaches that, then the process in that context is stopped. Time, this is back to the idea of the card playing robot. In that example, we're just showing how time relates to resetting the original conditions. And one other one that wasn't talked about and central to this argument is excessive cerebral interference, crosstalk. You'll see what I mean when you get into the rest of the presentation. So crosstalk, cerebral interference, is indirect intercerebral interference. As the number of cerebral processing units being stimulated increases, there will be an increase in the probability that extraneous energies interference generated by each of the units will deleteriously affect the cerebral patterns that are not directly associated with this. So the thing is, it's not per se the patterns that are formed, it's just which would be a qualitative thing. It's more of a quantitative. It's how many of the individual units that are being brought to bear, and this is specifically for nonlinear existentialism, because for nonlinear existentialism, again, the idea of amplitude modulation, which is going to be basically variance and a form of interference, and that's going to be a truth that the more units that are brought to bear, the more indirect intercerebral interference that occurs. So just the background of cerebral interference, you've got FAM, which is non-pattern, which is going to be our intrinsic creation of variance. This is the V1B layer. Then there's going to be the interference variance in the patterns which are directly stimulated. Variance is additive, whereas interference is not. As shown in previous diagrams, the variance is going to be from the original conditions and everything. Time it goes through a FAM, there's going to be more variance, but not interference, because every time you have the variance, it goes through the top layers, and that reasserts linearity. But the thing is that now it's further and further away from the original conditions. So the variance has added, but the interference has not. And then indirectly associated with the stimulated pattern, what I talked about before as crosstalk. For number 2, these will be associated with the pattern, and number 3, it's indirectly associated with the pattern. So you just see in this one that I was just trying to show that at the top it's input. This entire context is going to be saying that you're going to have many of these times when input comes to the top and it goes through the top part, the cerebral patterns, the stable part, and you go V1B, and you're going to have the amplitude coming back, variance in amplitude, and the output will feed back into the input, depending on whether or not the energetics have been released, have been achieved. The way to look at this one, this is very stylized, it's like a string. If you look at just basically the idea of vertical, we have the input coming in, causes the string to vibrate, and as it goes down, as it asserts itself upon the patterns, a certain patterns reach, the modulation of the variance decreases, and then will be increased and B1B if the conditions have not been reached. We can see for crosstalk on the first one is that when, again, this is just going to be basically on the number of units coming in, when they're close together, the variance between the two can feed off of each other. And in this case, on the left-hand side, we'll look at a more of a male condition where you have 4 input, 4 output, and the amount of variance that's caused between the two isn't so much that we would have a decrease On the right-hand side, you'll have 9 input, 5 output, so you have 4 decrease. And what you have is excessive, just in this case, excessive interference, that perhaps with too many inputs, and if they're too close together, that the system is overly stimulated, not because of the pattern, but just because of the physical relationship distance to each other. This is just a 2D representation. Again, it's very stylized, but in the actual cerebral cortex, when you've got pyramidal, you've got interneurons, you've got satellites, and everything else like that, the amount of interconnectivity is going to be extremely high. So the thing is that just through physicality, the more units that come in, and each one of these units, as suggested by FAM processors, are in variance or are modulating, that the modulation can build upon each other and dissipate itself, as you would have a number of strings if they hit each other. If it's too much, it will cause them to diminish, to wipe each other out in a way. So the thing is that that's the idea, is that this is more of a non-pattern cerebral interference as opposed to pattern cerebral interference. So just kind of tease the two apart. The other one is going to be interference and efficiency, just the relationship between global processing efficiency and number of cerebral units engaged. So as, let's say, the female, that they have a lot more units that are being engaged because they're more engaged in the environment. And the thing is that, however, because of the interference that's being created between the individual units because of just the density, what's happening in that case is that the overall cerebral processing efficiency decreases just purely from physicality and how they relate to each other. So the primary conclusion, it could be postulated if the female is more engaged in the external environment than a male, that while this leads to a greater change in the number of cerebral process units activated, produced, modified, or created, elicited per time unit, it also reduces the overall global processing efficiency of these units. Whereas for males, while they have a lower number of cerebral processing units engaged and therefore a lower number of patterns activated, produced, modified, created, elicited per time period, due to this, the global processing efficiency is higher for these units, even though they have less units. So another primary conclusion, and in keeping with nonlinear existentialism, such changes in global efficiency of the processing units as a result of the number of units engaged is an inherent property of the central nervous system and not solely the result of the created residual incongruencies that occur between the sensory patterns stored and or developed in the cerebral cortex, as passive models of the nervous system would suggest. So, because of FAM, and FAM is more processing occurs, that we're going to have higher amounts of modulation. If you've got the units not very close to each other, there's going to be a chance between the modulation at V1B and going back into the system. And if the individual units, the channels, the strings that are not close together, then that modulation can die to a certain extent. So the thing is that the proper pattern and such is found. However, if you go into the idea of a linear model, it would be relatively, it wouldn't count. The thing is that the more units, the units are considered linear. So the thing is that if they go back into the system again, and they are not being amplitude modulated, then they wouldn't suggest that this would occur except for in cases where the patterns themselves are causing the interference or variance, which they may or may not suggest. So for FAM, this is an important consideration, that the number of units and how close the units are, there's a possibility inherently, regardless of the pattern per se, of variance being created. Whereas with the normal linear models, linear existentialism, behavioralism, whatever you want to call it, that they get into the idea that no, it's just the pattern itself, not the actual system, which can create the interference which they don't really look at or suggest or think occur. So those are the very important difference between the two. And getting into more precise secondary conclusions, nonlinear existentialism suggests men and women have the same functional FAM, frequency amplitude modulating processing units, and the observed and or experienced behavioral psychological cultural differences are due to the number of units engaged, as has been suggested. Conclusion 2, while women employ a greater number of FAM units, the high amount of indirect intercerebral interference created does allow for a high degree of contained, does not allow for a high degree of contained variance within defined limited tasks. The idea is, again, this is not a moral statement, but just taking the functionality and taking it a step further, that if all these units are being brought to bear, and they, as more of them are brought to bear, and they have this crosstalk, that the thing is that the ability to focus on one or two specific tasks, one number of tasks may be limited, because as the processes occur, it's going to be the cerebral efficiency is going to be reduced because of the crosstalk. Whereas for men, there's less units, and the thing is, because there's less units, even though they're less engaged in the environment, they're able to focus more on limited tasks, because they begin with limited tasks. So they might be able to have a higher degree of contained variance within defined limited tasks. So the variance is going to be variance to that task, not variance that's created from another channel beside it. So the thing is that they can focus more upon defined tasks, whereas the women in this context, given this functionality, given this paradigm, cannot. So let's get back to the question. Do the genders think differently, and if so, how and why? Do the genders think differently? I propose that they do. How? Do the average number of FAM units that are being engaged per time unit. The male is lower, the female is higher. And the reason why the female is higher is that they have more engagement, they have to be more engaged, be more aware of the environment. They're more aware of the environment, they're more able to find things that within the environment that might cause them harm, and also they might find things within the environment that can help them. Whereas with the male, in comparison to the female, their physicality allows them to be less sensitive to overall things. They can be sensitive to specific things in the environment. A physical being going in there are going to be looking for other things, or physical beings that they're going to be concerned about, maybe other animals, other people, other men. Whereas for female, they have to be aware of many more things, so that they can look for advantages, look for ways to cope, not for just for themselves, but also for their child. So these are things that are going to be, I think they do have to be considered. And again, FAM has always been a functional system. It is built upon the ideas of nonlinear existentialism, but nonlinear existentialism is an attempt to take philosophical ideas, general ideas of being, purpose, ontology, epistemology, and try and link them to a physical network process within the individual, and see how one can lead to another, not the other way. We have philosophy trying to understand basic body functions, but it's actually the basic body functions will lead to the philosophy, psychology, and this way, psychology as how a female and male might think differently. I hope this is enlightening. The purpose of this, again, was just to take the basic tenets of nonlinear existentialism, take them a little bit further, and say that if as the central tenet of nonlinear existentialism is to see if it can be applied to as many of the sciences and sub-sciences as possible, to see if there's any merit in the original idea. I thank you very much for your time, and have a pleasant evening. Goodbye.